A pewter sky presses down on the mountain. The wind has stopped, and the silence it leaves behind has a weight to it. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Below, in the valley, they have already finished telling the story of how she is going to die. They say she has lost her mind. They say the cold has taken it. Because behind her cabin, alone, with raw and bleeding hands, she is swinging a pickaxe into a frozen ridge, digging a dark hole into the side of a mountain that has killed better prepared men than her. They call it a grave. She calls it something else. She does not know that the worst storm any of them has ever seen is already gathering, far off, in a corner of the sky no one has thought to watch. But she can feel it coming, and she is not going to run. She lifts the pickaxe, she swings. A pewter sky pressed down on the mountain. Wind moved through the timberline, bending the pines into slow, dark waves. Snow lifted off the high ridges and drifted sideways, thin as smoke. And somewhere below the tree line, in all that cold and quiet, a single thread of wood smoke rose straight up into the still air. The camera of the eye drifts lower. A cabin appears, small against the granite, half buried already in the season's first heavy drift. And behind it, at the base of the ridge, there is a darkness in the hillside, an opening, a wound cut deliberately into the earth. A woman stands at the mouth of it. Her coat is too large at the shoulders. A man's coat, worn by someone who is not a man. In one raw, ungloved hand she holds a pickaxe, loose, the way you hold a tool you have been holding for hours. Her breath makes a small cloud that does not want to leave her face. Down in the valley below her, they have already finished telling the story of how she is going to die. She lifts the pickaxe, she swings. Her name was Cora Hale. She was 31 years old. And on that gray morning, alone above the timberline, she was doing a thing that everyone who knew of it believed was madness. She had not always lived up here, in the thin air where the wind never fully rested. Once she had lived somewhere gentle, a green place with soft weather and forgiving hills. She had married a man with red hair and a laugh that made a room feel smaller in the best way. Elias. His name was Elias. He had brought her west with everything they owned rolled into a single wagon. They had built the cabin together. He cut and notched the logs. She packed the walls and split the roof shingles by hand. It was not a fine house, but it was a house that meant to hold. Then, one spring, a rumor came down out of the silver country, a rumor of easy fortune, of a rich vein waiting in the ground for any man brave enough to go dig it out. And Elias listened. He would be gone 3 months, he told her. 4 at the most, long enough to bring back a real cook stove, glass windows for the front wall and the north, money enough that the two of them would never again spend a winter counting firewood like a miser counts coins. He kissed her at the cabin door. He walked down the switchback trail until the pines closed over his shoulders, and then over his hat. He turned once. He waved. She waved back. That was the last time she saw him. One letter came, near the height of summer, carried up the mountain by a freight hauler who wanted silver for the trouble. Elias wrote that he had partnered on a promising claim, that the work was hard but the vein was true, that he missed her and would be home before the first snow with real money in his coat. She had put the letter under her pillow that night. She had cried, quietly, from what she told herself was relief. She did not yet know that a letter can be the last thing a person ever hears from someone they love. Summer thinned into autumn. Autumn began to bite, and no second letter came. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a woman waiting for word that does not arrive. It is not empty. It is heavy. It has weight. It sits under the breastbone like a stone swallowed whole. And it grows a little larger with every day the trail stays empty. By the time the first hard snows came, Cora Hale had stopped pretending she was only waiting. She rode down to the settlement once, 2 days south, over ground already going white. She asked her question at the little clapboard building where the mail came in, and the lean man behind the counter gave her the answer he had clearly given too many women in too many doorways. He did not quite meet her eyes. There was no letter. There had been no letter since summer. He had asked after her husband's name along the last freight run, and he had heard nothing. That did not mean anything, he was quick to say. But his face said otherwise. It was an older woman who found her afterward, standing in the cold street with one hand pressed flat against her own stomach, as though holding something in. Della Hutchins. A woman who had buried her own husband and both her grown sons in a single cruel season, years before, and had somehow gone on living anyway. She took Cora by the elbow without asking permission. "Come in and sit down," she said, "before you fall down." And later, over coffee gone bitter from too much reheating, the old woman said a thing that Cora would carry with her all the way into the deepest part of that winter. "Men go into the mountains, honey, the way stones go down a well." She let that sit. "You have stood at the top of that well long enough. It is time you turned around and looked at your own winter." Cora rode back up the mountain in a silence so complete she could hear the mule-breathing shapes into the cold. She reached the cabin at dusk, and she stood for a long time at the north wall of her own house, with one gloved hand pressed flat against the logs. The wall was warmer than the others. She had noticed it before, without letting herself understand what she was noticing. The ridge rose up close behind the cabin there, like a great shoulder turned against the wind, and the earth of it held something, a faint, stubborn warmth that the open air did not have. She took her hand away. She went inside, and the next morning she went out to look at the woodpile. That was where the arithmetic turned cruel. Elias had cut and stacked the wood before he left, along the west wall, under a length of oiled canvas. It had looked, in the green light of summer, like plenty. It was not plenty. The first storm had torn the canvas along a seam and shoved a drift up under the whole stack. When she pulled the wet cloth back that morning, she found the top of it dry, the middle of it damp, and the bottom of it sitting in a slush of half-frozen melt that had soaked upward through the lowest rounds until they were dark and heavy and already going soft. She stood there with the cold coming up through the soles of her boots, and she did the math out loud, so the mountain could hear it, so she could not lie to herself about it. Winter up here ran 5 months in a kind year, closer to 6 in a hard one. She was already deep into it, burning careful, letting the fire die to embers at night, warming only the small core of the cabin, and she would run out of dry wood, somewhere in the deep heart of the cold, the exact stretch of the season when the real killing frost came down. The kind that split standing trees straight through with a sound like a rifle shot. She could try to cut more. She had a saw. She had an axe. But there was standing deadwood only far down the slope. past drifts already gone knee-deep and thigh-deep in places. One log, dragged up alone through snow by a woman breaking her own trail, would cost her an entire day. And a person who spent every day of a mountain winter earning a single log usually did not see the spring. She understood, standing there, exactly how the valley expected her to die. Not from one dramatic thing, from the slow, ordinary arithmetic of it, from doing what any reasonable person would do, and running out of time. And so that night, somewhere in the small dark hours, Cora Hale stopped being reasonable. She got up. She put on that too large coat. She went out the back door, the one that faced the ridge, and she stood in the black cold with her palm against the north wall again. Warmer, not warm. Nothing on that mountain was warm, but warmer than the killing air just 8 inches to her left, where the wall ended and the wind began. She thought about the earth, about how it holds a temperature the way a nest holds an egg, about the cold that lived in the open air, and the different, gentler cold that lived inside the ground. And a thought took shape in her, terrible and clear. If the mountain would not give her wood, then perhaps the mountain would keep it for her instead. She went back inside. She sat at the table by the low light of a tallow candle. She took a scrap of paper and the stub of a pencil, and she began to draw. Down in the valley, they were already grieving her. They did not yet know that the woman they had decided to bury had just picked up a pickaxe. The drawing took her most of the night. She was not an artist. The lines came out crooked, then straight, then crooked again as her cold hand cramped around the pencil stub. But by the time the candle had burned down to a soft puddle of fat, the thing on the paper had become something she could believe in. A tunnel, driven straight back into the base of the ridge, behind the north wall of the cabin, deep enough to hold every stick of wood she owned, high enough that she could move inside without crawling on her belly, and angled gently upward, so that any water seeping in at the mouth would run back out the way it came, and never once pool around the wood. She had seen a thing like it long ago in the green country of her girlhood. Her grandmother had kept a small stone room dug back into the side of a low hill, a cool, dark place where the butter never turned in the worst heat of summer, and the water in the crock never once skinned over with ice in the deep of winter. A child had stood in that cool dark, with her small hand pressed flat to the packed clay wall, and heard an old woman say a thing she had been far too young to understand. The earth holds the warmth, child, the way a nest holds the egg. She could still hear the voice. If you know how to ask it, it will not refuse you. Cora had carried that sentence a very long way, over a great many miles, without ever quite knowing why she kept it. Now she knew why. She folded the drawing in half. She banked the coals down to a red glow. She slept for a few short hours, hard and dreamless. And when the gray light came up over the ridge, she put on every layer of wool she owned beneath that oversized coat, took the pickaxe down from the shed wall, and walked around to the north side of her own house. She stood at the base of the ridge. She picked her spot, a low shelf of ground where the slope began to rise, and she swung. The point of the axe bounced off the frozen crust with a shock that ran up the handle and into her shoulder like the flat of a hand across the face. The ground rang back at her, hard as struck iron. She set her feet wider. She swung again. This time, the point bit in. 1/2 inch, maybe less. She worked it back and forth, patient, until she could lift out a single chip of frozen earth no bigger than a playing card. She held that chip in her raw palm for a long moment, looked at it. As if it were the first coin of a fortune she was not sure she would live to spend. Then she set it aside and swung again. By the end of that first day, she had made a shallow bowl in the hillside. Nothing more. A dent the size of a wash basin, no deeper than her forearm was long. Her shoulders had begun to ache in a way she had not known shoulders could ache. Her palms had gone raw beneath the gloves, the skin split at the base of each finger. She went inside. She rubbed grease into her hands and wound them in strips of clean cloth. She ate a piece of hard biscuit softened in coffee she had already made twice from the same grounds, and she thought about the second day. There would have to be a great many days. She did not let herself count them. Counting them, she suspected, was a good way to give up. By the third day, she was through the worst of the frozen crust and down into the packed clay and loose stone beneath. Here the ground gave more easily. The pickaxe went in with less of a fight. The trouble was no longer breaking the earth. The trouble was moving it. She rigged a sling out of an old feed sack, filled it with the broken ground, and dragged it out to a pile beside the mouth. When the sack proved too slow, she built a crude barrow from 2 porch planks and a spare wagon wheel, and after that, the work went faster. Every day, she drove a little deeper into the hill. Every day, the heap of cast-out earth beside the opening grew a little higher, and every day, from a distance, from the ridge road, from the trail below, it looked more and more like exactly the thing the valley was already whispering it was. A grave. A woman. Alone. Digging a dark hole into the side of a mountain and piling the earth of it up beside her own front door. It was on the 6th day of digging that the first of them came. She heard the wagon before she saw it. The dry creak of cold, stiff wheels, the slow, heavy clop of a tired team on frozen ground. She stepped back from the mouth of the tunnel, the pickaxe leaning against her hip, and she watched the switchback trail. A man drove up out of the trees. His name was Amos Carter. He was a lean, weathered figure who had been hauling flour and salt and lamp oil up to the scattered homesteads of that high country for the better part of a lifetime. He knew every claim within a day's ride of the settlement. He knew which ones would last the winter and which ones would not. And he was almost never wrong. He drew rein at the edge of the small clearing. He sat there a moment, taking her in. The man's coat, too big at the shoulders, the bloodied strips of cloth on her hands, the dark mouth in the hillside behind her, and the heap of raw earth beside it. Then he let out a long, slow breath through his nose that made a cloud in the cold air between them. He climbed down stiffly. His knees did not want the ground. He did not come to her first. He went to the tunnel. He crouched at the mouth of it and looked in, a long time, at the soft lantern glow on the raw dug walls, at the packed floor, at the way she had angled the whole of it gently up into the hill. His face did not change. When at last he stood, his joints cracked in the quiet. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "are you digging a cellar? Or are you digging a grave?" She did not flinch. "Storage," she said. "Storage for what?" "Firewood." He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse that has just done something no horse should be able to do. Not cruel, not mocking, Just a man whose own arithmetic would not come out to the same answer as hers, and who did not yet know how to say so. Fire needs air, Mrs. Hale. His voice was gentle, and gentle was worse, somehow, than hard would have been. Wood needs sun, open sky. You put dry wood down in a hole in the ground. It molds in the fall. It rots by spring. It will not take a spark either way. He shook his head slowly. That is not storage, ma'am. That is a burial. She leaned on the pickaxe. Her breath came in small, careful clouds. The earth holds its temperature, she said. Below a certain depth, it stays above freezing all winter long. Wood down in there will not get wet the way it does out here. It will not glaze over in an ice storm. I will not have to break every log free of a block of ice each time I want to build a fire. He took his hat off. He dragged a hand through hair gone the color of old ash. And when he looked back at her, the thing in his face had softened into something worse than any argument. Pity. The plain, tired pity of a man who liked her and did not want to be the one who came back in the thaw and found what the winter had left. You know how many folks I have watched lose to these mountains, he said. Most of them lost by trying something clever. The cold does not care about clever, Mrs. Hale. The cold only cares about one thing, whether you can keep a fire going. And to keep a fire going, you need dry wood. And dry wood belongs above the ground, in the open air, where it was meant to be. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, it was not to win. It was to set something down plainly so that later she would know exactly what she had said and to whom. Mr. Carter, where I come from, my grandmother kept water in a hole in the ground for 60 years. It never froze, not once. Not in the hardest winter that country ever knew. She let it sit between them in the cold. She understood a thing the men up here have forgotten. I am not asking you to believe me. I am only asking you to come back in the spring and see what is left. He looked at her a long moment. Then he settled his hat back down onto his head and touched 2 fingers to the brim. Good luck to you, ma'am, he said. You are going to need every last bit of it. He climbed back up onto the wagon. He clucked once to the team, and he did not look back at her as he turned the wagon around and started down the switchback. She watched him go until the wagon was small enough to hide behind her thumb. And when he was gone from sight, a hollow place opened, slow and cold, in her chest, in the exact spot where she had been trying so hard to keep the arithmetic warm. She turned. She went back into the tunnel. She swung the pickaxe. The chip of stone that came away was the size of a hen's egg. She put it in the sling. She swung again. Word travels down a mountain faster than any one person can carry it. Amos Carter was not a man given to gossip, but he was a man given to worry, and worry has a longer tongue than gossip ever did. He stopped at more than one cabin on his way down, and by the time another week had turned, there was not a homestead within a day's ride that had not heard some version of the story. And the story was not unkind. That was the very worst of it. It was mournful. The Hale woman, they said to one another over their own fires, had broken at last under the weight of her husband's long silence and the coming dark of the cold. She was digging herself a burrow into the hill behind her cabin, the way a frightened animal digs into the side of a ditch. She would fill it up with the last of her firewood. And when the wood was gone, She would simply crawl in after it and lie down and not get up. It was a gentle story. It was the kind of story a settlement tells about a neighbor it has already, in its own quiet heart, begun to grieve. Only one soul in all that valley refused to repeat a single word of it. Della Hutchins. A woman who had buried a husband and both her grown sons in one cruel season, years before, and had somehow gone on drawing breath afterward. She knew more about surviving a loss than any minister in that country. And when the story reached her door, she did not pass it along. Instead, she wrote out a few words in a careful, old-fashioned hand and folded them around a small cloth bag of flax seed and sent it up the mountain with the next hauler brave enough to go that high. The note said only this: "I believe you, honey. Plant these come spring. I want to see them bloom next fall." Cora read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She put it in the small tin box on the mantel, the box where she kept the one letter Elias had written her in the height of summer, the last of him she had. And she went back out to the tunnel, and for the first time since Amos Carter's wagon had gone small behind her thumb, she did not feel entirely alone on that mountain. She was deep into the second week of the digging, and a full 8 feet into the hill when the second visit came. And this one did not soften anything at all. 2 riders came up the switchback on a pair of shaggy, thick-coated mountain horses and drew rein at the edge of the clearing without a single word of greeting. She knew them by their reputation before they ever gave her their names. The Calder brothers. They came from a family that had drifted into that high country a generation back, following the trap lines, and now they ran a line of their own that reached from the low draws all the way up into the country above the trees. By every measure that meant anything up there, they were expert wintermen. They had wintered in dugouts. They had, in one bad year, wintered inside a hollow scooped from a packed snowbank with nothing but a single small oil lamp between them and the dark. When those 2 men spoke about the cold, other men fell silent and listened. The elder brother swung down first. Reuben. He was tall and gaunt, and he moved with the economy of a man who had never once in his whole life wasted a single step. His face was the color of tanned harness leather. His beard had gone gray early, in streaks. He walked straight to the mouth of the tunnel, without asking her leave, and he crouched and he looked inside for a long, long while. Then he stood, and he walked the whole perimeter of the cabin, and he laid a bare hand flat against the north wall, where the ridge came in close behind. He found the hatch there, the small square door she had framed through the log wall, so that on the very worst mornings she might reach through into the tunnel without ever once opening the outer door to the killing air. He ran his fingers along its frame. He gripped the edge of it and tugged, testing. Then he came back to where she stood. "You cut a door through your own north wall," he said. "I did. You weakened your own house, in the deep of the cold, this high up the mountain." "I framed it," she said. "It is stronger there now than it was before." He did not answer that. He looked at the tunnel roof. He looked at her crude barrow. He looked at last at her hands, wound in their bloodied wraps of cloth. The younger brother had stayed up on his horse, Micah. He was softer around the eyes than his brother was, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the gentler music of the far country the family had left behind long ago. "Ma'am," he said, My brother is about to say some hard things to you, and he will not be wrong about most of them. But I want you to know, before he begins, we have watched you working from the ridge road these last few days, going past. And on the second day, my brother turned to me and said that whatever else this was, it was not the work of a woman who had given up. Reuben shot his brother a look that could have stripped the bark clean off a standing pine. Then he turned back to her. "The tunnel will kill you," he said. "Not the way you are picturing it. Not by falling in on your head, though it may do that too, before you are through." He took a step closer. "It will kill you because the wood you put down in there is going to sweat. The warm off the stone meets the cold off the deep pieces at the back of it, and it turns to water. And that water freezes hard on the far logs, and it molds the near ones soft. And then, in the very worst of the deep cold, when you need every single stick to burn hot and burn clean, you will open that little door of yours and reach your hand in and pull out a log that will not take a spark." His voice dropped low. "And by then, ma'am, you will not have the strength left in you to go out and cut more. I have watched men die that way. I have known women it happened to. I am telling you this because I do not want to ride back through here when the snow softens and be the one who finds you." Cora was quiet, and then she said simply, "The wood will not sweat." He waited. "The tunnel goes up," she said. "The air inside it is dry, and it is still. There is no wind down in there to drive the wet into the grain of the wood. And I am laying every stick of it up on the stone, off the damp of the floor. It will not sweat, Mr. Calder." "You do not know that." "I know it." "How can you know it?" She held his gaze and did not look away. "Because my grandmother knew it. 60 years she kept a room dug into the side of a hill. Butter that did not spoil in the worst heat of the summer. Water that did not freeze in the worst cold of the winter. She never read it in any book. She did it, and it worked, and her own mother did it before her. I watched it work with my own 2 eyes every summer of my childhood until I was very near grown." She lifted her chin. "I am not guessing, Mr. Calder. I am remembering. There is a difference between the two." Reuben Calder was silent for a long moment, and then he did a thing she had not expected of him. He did not touch his hat. He simply held her eyes for a moment and gave a single slow nod, the way a man marks a spot on the ground that he means to return to. For his was not the goodbye that Amos Carter had given her. Carter had been telling a quiet farewell to a woman he fully expected to bury. Reuben Calder was setting down a marker. "We will come back through this way in the late part of the winter," he said. "If you are still here, we will help you in whatever way we can. And if you are not, then we will bury what we find. And we will send word to whatever people you have got left in this world." He let that settle in the cold between them. "That is the promise I can make you. No more and no less." "Thank you, Mr. Calder." They rode out. At the top of the switchback, the younger brother turned in his saddle and looked back at her, just once. He raised a gloved hand. She raised hers. And then she turned back to the tunnel. She was 8 feet in. By her own reckoning, she had 7 feet still to dig. and she did not know how many days the mountain meant to give her before the thing she was digging against came down at last out of the sky. She swung the pickaxe. She did not stop until the last of the light had failed. The days that came after were the loneliest of that whole long, hard season. The story had spread the length of the valley now, into every kitchen, into every pew. And on one of those cold Sundays, a young traveling minister who had ridden the high circuit for barely a year stood up in the little settlement chapel and spoke with real and honest sorrow about a woman he had never once met in his life. He did not use the word mad. He did not have to use it. He spoke instead about grief, about the way a great sorrow can lead a soul off into what he called, in words he chose himself, the darker country. He asked the whole congregation to pray for the widow up on the high claim. She had, he feared, wandered into that darker country, and she might not, he feared, find her own way back out of it. By the end of that week, the phrase had traveled from the front pew to the trading post, to the door of every cabin for 30 miles in every direction. The darker country. That was the thing she had become to them now. Not a woman solving a hard problem with her own two hands. A cautionary tale. A sad shape in a doorway. A prayer said soft and mournful over someone not yet even dead. And up on her ridge, in the thin and bitter air, Cora Hale did not know the exact words of it. But she felt the shape of them, the way a person alone can always somehow feel it, when a whole valley below has quietly agreed to mourn her while she still draws breath. She kept digging. 10 feet, 11 feet, 12. The work itself changed as the tunnel drove deeper. Now the roof was too low for a full swing of the arms, and she had to chip at the face of it with a short, cramped stroke. Sitting back on her heels, the lantern hung from an iron hook she had driven into the wall for the purpose. Her whole body ached now in ways that no longer fully faded in the night. But the hill of cast earth beside the mouth had grown tall, and the tunnel had begun, at last, to feel like a real and solid thing. Not an idea anymore. A place. A room in the mountain. On one of those short gray afternoons, alone in the deep cold, with only the pickaxe for company, she let herself say aloud the thing she had not said to Carter, nor to the Calder brothers, nor to a single living soul. He is not coming back. Just that. The words went out into the still air of the tunnel and did not echo at all. The packed earth of the walls swallowed them gently, the way the good earth swallows everything that is finally given over to it. She did not weep. Not then. She had a sense, even in that moment, that the weeping was still somewhere out ahead of her, waiting its turn, that it would come at the hour of its own choosing, and not one moment before. So she set the words down in the dark, and she picked the pickaxe back up. The reaching of the wall came on a cold and windless evening near the very end of the second week. She had driven the tunnel a full 15 feet into the ridge, and now, working from inside by the light of the lantern, she began to cut the last short distance through the log wall of the cabin itself, up at the back, to join the tunnel to the small framed hatch on the other side. She worked slowly, carefully. This was the joint the whole design turned upon. Cut it wrong, and she would weaken the corner of her own house in the deep of the cold. Cut it right, and the two spaces, the warm heart of the cabin and the cool dark of the tunnel, would become, from that moment on, A single thing. One sheltered world with the whole weight of the mountain at its back. When the last of the wood gave way and the two openings finally met, she set down her tools. She put her bare hand into the gap, and she felt it. Air, moving, slow and faint, but there, unmistakable. Air drifting out of the tunnel and into the room. It was not warm air. Nothing on that mountain was ever truly warm. But it was so very much less cruel than the killing dark on the far side of her walls that a bare hand held within it could feel the whole difference. It was a gift of the earth. The stubborn, patient warmth her grandmother had promised her all those years ago was there for the asking. If only a person knew how to ask. She stood very still, with her hand in that slow-moving air, for a long, long time. She thought about the old woman in the cool stone room, so far away now, and so long ago. She thought about Amos Carter's pity, and the young minister's mournful prayer, and the whole valley below her, grieving in advance a woman who was not yet gone. She thought about Reuben Calder, marking the spot where he believed her grave would be, with nothing but a slow nod and a promise. And something moved, low, beneath her breastbone. It was not happiness. It was far too early still for anything as bright as happiness. But it was something that shared a border with it. Something that had not lived in her chest since the morning she had watched a red-haired man wave once and vanish into the pines below. She sealed the hatch with a plank door on leather hinges. She folded a heavy wool blanket against it to hold the earth warmth in, and she stood there in the middle of the cabin with the door of the whole outer world shut fast behind her, and the cold mountain held off now at the length of an arm. And for the first time in a long and aching while, there was a thing beneath her ribs that was not quite hope, and was not quite pride, but knew the both of them, well, by name. Down in the valley, they were still telling one another the story of how she was going to die. They did not know that the hole in the mountainside was finished now. They did not know that the woman they had already buried in their gentle prayers had just, with her own two ruined hands, built herself a door straight into the beating heart of the ridge. And they did not know, not yet, that the true test of every single thing she had made was already gathering, far off, silent, in a cold corner of the sky that no one down in that valley had ever once thought to watch. Now came the moving of the wood. She carried it, piece by piece, from the ruined pile along the west wall, around the corner of the cabin, and into the dark mouth of the tunnel. It was slow work, cold work. Her arms had nothing left in them after 2 weeks of digging, and still she made them find a little more. She stacked the wood along the walls on the flat creek stones she had laid down across the floor, and she left a narrow aisle running down the center so she could still reach the pieces at the very back. She was careful about it. She thought about it the way a person thinks about a thing they have paid for in blood. The driest wood she stacked nearest the hatch, where her hand would find it first on the worst mornings. The damp and the half-frozen pieces she carried all the way to the back, where the still dry air of the deep tunnel would work on them slowly, patiently, through the coldest weeks that were still to come. It took her 4 full days to move it all, and when it was done, when the very last stick had been laid in its place, The tunnel held every bit of usable fuel on the whole of that mountain claim, and some that was not yet, by any other person's reckoning, usable at all. From the outside, it looked like a dark hole in a hillside, crowded with shadowy, stacked shapes. It looked like exactly the thing her neighbors had been telling one another she was building. A burrow, a grave, already half filled with the things a dying woman would want near her at the end. But from the inside, on the evening she finished with the hatch cracked open and a single candle lifted up to the dark, it looked like something else entirely. The candlelight picked out the pale-cut ends of the logs, row upon row of them, curving away gently into the shadow. The air smelled of dry pitch and cold stone, and the faint resin she had loosened from the pine as she stacked it. And it was quiet in there, deeply, perfectly quiet. The kind of quiet that lives only in the heart of a mountain where no wind has ever reached. It looked like a chapel. She stood in the mouth of it a long while, the candle steady in her hand, and she did not have a word for the thing she felt. She thought about her grandmother in a green country a whole lifetime away. She thought about the small hand of a child, pressed flat to a packed clay wall, and an old, patient voice saying, "If you know how to ask it, it will not refuse you." Then she closed the hatch. She folded the wool blanket against it, and she banked the fire, and she went to bed. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of that whole long season, in a way she had never once expected. Because they were made of nothing at all but waiting. There was no more digging to be done, no more wood to be moved. The great work was finished, and there was nothing left now to hold the fear back but small tasks and long silence. So she filled the days with small tasks. She patched the chinking on the west wall, where an early freeze had washed the clay out of the seams. She stretched 2 more layers of oiled paper across the little south window, one laid over the other, to slow the loss of warmth through the thin glass. She sewed a second lining into her heavy cloak, working the needle by firelight until her eyes ached and blurred. She rendered the last of her tallow and dipped candles by the dozen, standing at the table through whole gray afternoons, her hands smelling of smoke and fat. And she took stock of the pantry. She laid it all out on the table, and she counted it. Twice, the way a careful person counts the thing that stands between them and the dark. Flour, dried beans, a little coffee, a small crock of lard, one side of smoked meat hanging in the shed, a bushel of potatoes, packed in straw against the cold, a string of dried onions, a tin of salt. It was enough, by her figuring, to carry her 4 months. If she was careful, if she was very careful, it was not enough to carry her 6. She wrote that number down in a small leather book, and she looked at it a long time by the low candle, and then she wrote beneath it, in the plain hand she had been taught as a girl, a single line. She underlined it once. Let it be known that she tried by her own understanding, and not by the understanding of those who had already decided what would kill her. Then she closed the book. She put out the candle. And she stood at the window a while, her forehead against the cold glass, watching the black pines and the blacker sky, and the first small white flakes drifting down out of the darkness, in a way that was not yet a storm, and was no longer quite just weather. The morning it began, the wind stopped. That was the first thing she noticed. Before she had even opened her eyes, The wind had been blowing steady out of the high country for 3 days and 3 nights. An ordinary winter wind. The kind of wind a person learns, after a while, to sleep straight through without ever waking. It had stopped in the night, and the absence of it was so complete, so utterly total, that the silence itself seemed to have a weight to it. It pressed down on the whole world, and the weight of it was the thing that had woken her. She got out of bed. She dressed in the cold half-dark, her breath a pale cloud before her face. She went to the little south window and scraped a peephole clear of the frost with the edge of her thumbnail, and she looked out. The valley below the cabin was clear. The pines stood utterly, unnaturally still. Not a single needle moved, and the sky above the ridge toward the high country was the color of old lead, the color of pewter left out in the rain, the color of the underside of a cast iron pot. She had never, in the whole of her life, seen a sky quite that color. And the far edge of the world beneath it looked flat and hard, as though someone had taken a straight edge and a heavy hand and drawn a single line along the very top of everything. She went to the little thermometer that hung outside the north window. She watched it for a full minute, and in that 1 minute, the reading fell. She felt the weather then in a way she had never once felt weather before in her life. Not on her skin, under her breastbone, like the low, long note of a great bell, struck somewhere very far away, that was only now, this very moment, reaching her across all that silent distance. She went out the back door. She stood in the little path she had shoveled between the cabin and the mouth of the tunnel, and she looked up, at the ridge above her, at the pines, standing dead still in the airless cold, at that leaden sky, at the flat, hard line where the sky met the top of the far country. And she said aloud, to the empty white world, the thing she had been holding under her tongue since the moment she first saw the color of it. I do not know what is coming down out of that sky. Her breath hung in the still air and would not leave her. But I know I have done every honest thing I could do to meet it. She let it settle. Whatever it is now, it is between me and the mountain. She went back inside, and she began quietly, without any hurry, to make herself ready. She built the fire up to a full, roaring blaze, the first true blaze she had allowed herself in weeks. She set a heavy pot of water on to boil. She checked the hatch in the north wall and the plank door behind it, and the stacked wood beyond, and the wool blanket folded to seal the whole thing tight from the inside. She counted the candles. She counted the matches. She counted the coffee and the flour and the beans one more time. She fed the mule an extra measure of oats, and then she led him in from the shed, through the cold, into the small back stall inside the cabin itself. The stall that had been built for a milk cow they had never gotten around to buying, and she barred the door behind him. Then she stood in the middle of the warm kitchen, both hands resting on the back of a wooden chair. And she waited. At the middle of the day, the first flakes came. They were fat, and they were slow, and they fell straight down out of the airless quiet, one at a time, almost gentle, almost kind. For a little while, it was very nearly beautiful. And then, in the early part of the afternoon, the wind came back. It was not the wind of the days before. It came down out of the high country in one long, low, unbroken note, without a single gust to break it, steady, patient, relentless. And it took those fat, slow, gentle flakes, and it drove them sideways until the whole air was full of them, until they flew past the little south window in a solid, hissing wall of white. By the darkening of the afternoon, she could no longer see the pines at the very edge of her own clearing. She closed the door. She drew the heavy bar across it. She sat down by the fire with the small leather book in her lap and the tin box beside her on the warm stones of the hearth. The box with the one letter inside it. The last true thing of him she had left in all the world. And outside, the storm began to make the sound that she would remember for the rest of her days. The sound of a mountain. Slowly, deliberately, deciding whether or not it was going to let her live. The first night of it passed in a way that was almost, strangely, ordinary. The wind held steady out of the high country. The snow came down in a slant that never varied by more than a hand's width from straight across. And she fed the fire on the careful schedule she had worked out for herself weeks before. One small log, every little while. No more than that. Never more. And by the deep middle of the night, the cabin held at a warmth that would have shamed a fine kitchen in a soft and gentle country. And that, in the very deep of that killing cold, was a small and quiet miracle all its own. She slept a few hours, in her clothes, with the mule breathing soft and slow behind the barred stall door, and the fire ticking low in the grate. She woke to a darkness so complete that she thought, for one entire held breath, that she had gone blind in the night. Then, slowly, she understood. The little south window. The window that had given her every single dawn for as long as she had lived in that cabin. It was gone. It was buried. Not by falling snow. By snow driven sideways, all the long night, into a great packed wedge against the south wall. By a wind that had not slackened, not even once, in all the hours she had slept. The peephole she had scraped so carefully clear the morning before was gone now, under 2 solid feet of packed white. She lit a candle at the hearth. She carried it to the glass. She held it up. The glass was black. She turned. She went to the north hatch. She opened it a bare 1/4 of an inch, and she put the tips of her fingers into the gap, and the air that came through against her skin was not warm. Not warm at all. Not by the measure of any soft country in the world, but by every measure that had ever mattered up on that hard mountain. It was generous. She judged it, with her hand held there in the dark, to be far kinder than the murdering cold on the far side of her walls, and the cabin around her, warmed through the whole night by the steady fire, stood kinder still. The difference between the two of them, the difference between the good air in that tunnel and the killing air out beyond her door, was, in that one moment, the whole entire difference. The difference between a woman who would be breaking up her own furniture for kindling within days, and a woman who would walk out of the storm whenever it finally chose to end, with her firewood still stacked in its orderly rows, and her 2 hands still whole and unbroken. She reached her arm through the hatch. She found, by touch alone in the dark, the 4 split rounds she had laid nearest the opening the night before. She drew them out, one at a time. They were dry. They were smooth. And they were dry. And they had not been touched. Not by the wind. Not by the driven snow. Not by the killing ice that had glazed hard over every other living and dead thing on that whole vast mountain. She fed them to the fire in the exact order she had planned. The flames took them cleanly, hungrily, gratefully. There was almost no smoke. She stood there before the fire, her hands held out to the good, honest heat of it, and she understood a thing then, in a way she had not fully understood it before the storm had come. The tunnel was not a clever idea any longer. It was working. It was working exactly the way she had told Reuben Calder to his weathered face that it would work. In the exact terms an old woman had used, in a cool stone room, in a green country, a whole lifetime ago, and 1,000 miles away. And the knowing of it did not make her glad. If anything, it made her more solemn than before. She had carried the mere theory of the thing for so many long, doubting weeks. And now she was standing here, inside the living proof of it. And the proof would go on being tested. Hour after hour, without a single moment's pause or mercy. For just as long as that low, steady note held itself against the west wall of her house. Far off, down and across the valley, where the switchback trail dropped away toward the lower country, other cabins were already deep in trouble. She did not know it yet. She could not possibly have known it, sealed in as she was. But the very same storm that was, hour by hour, proving her right, was, at that same hour, proving a great many other good and careful people terribly and tragically wrong. There was a family down near where the two creeks met, a husband and a wife and 3 small children, and the youngest of them, a little girl no more than 3, had carried a small dry cough into the first days of the cold. A cough her mother had put down to nothing more than the turning of the season of their firewood was stacked the way that everyone's firewood was stacked all up and down that valley, in a 3-sided lean-to built snug against the south wall of the cabin. It had served them faithfully for 2 winters, but that lean-to had been built upon 2 quiet, unspoken assumptions: that snow falls mostly straight down, and that wind, when it comes at all, comes gently and from the familiar direction. The storm coming down out of the high country that day obeyed neither one of them. By the middle of the day, the lean-to had become a wind tunnel, packed solid with snow driven in so hard that the logs inside it were welded fast to one another and to the flat stones beneath, in a single frozen, useless mass. The husband went out into it with an axe. He came back a good while later with 3 logs, each of them sheathed in a hard 1/4 inch of clear ice, and with his eyebrows gone white with frost, and his lungs burning like fire in his chest. His wife laid a flat hand against his heart, and felt it running like a hunted rabbit's beneath his shirt. "You do not go back out there today," she told him, low, even. "Not for anything on this earth. We will burn what you have brought in, and we will burn what is in the box, and that will be the end of it." By the fall of the afternoon, the iced logs were down on the coals. They did not burn. They hissed. They wept water. They gave off a thin, sullen gray smoke that rose lazily up the chimney, until the wind reached down the flue with a cold hand and reversed the draft and drove all of it back down into the room in a slow, rolling, choking cloud. It stung the little girl's eyes, and it set her to coughing. And this time, the cough was not small, and it was not dry. Her mother lifted her up onto her lap and turned the small, hot face away from the smoke and held her and rocked her. The husband crossed the room and opened the one small window on the far wall to let the smoke find its way out. The window let in the killing cold instead. The whole room lost its hard-won warmth in the space of a single minute. He shut it again, fast, and the smoke came settling back down, low and gray along the ceiling. There was no third choice for them. There was only the smoke or the cold. One of them would surely hurt the child. The other would freeze the whole family where they sat. He looked at his wife across the small smoky room, and she looked back at him, and neither one of them said a single word, for there was nothing at all to be said that would have changed, by even a little, the terrible shape of the choice. And there was another man, alone, in a cabin some distance off. A man who had, by every account, done everything right. He had cut 4 full cords of good wood before the cold ever came, more than any other man within a day's hard ride. He was proud of that wood, and he had every right to be. And he had stacked every last stick of it in a neat, soldierly rank, a good distance out from his own door, near the tree line, on the sound and sensible notion that wood stacked too close to a cabin only drew rats to the walls. He had a saying he was fond of repeating. A man who could not walk a short way to his own woodpile in a bit of weather, he liked to say, did not rightly deserve to live up in the mountains at all. He made that short walk twice, on the first morning of the storm. On the second trip, breaking his own fresh trail through snow already gone thigh-deep, he came to understand that the trail he had broken not 1 hour before was already gone, erased, as though he had never walked it at all. On the third attempt, he made it only a short way from his own door, before he understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the air, that he could no longer see his own cabin behind him. There was only the white, the roaring, blinding, endless white, closing in on every side. He turned around, slowly. He counted his own steps back, and he came at last to his own door with a single log clutched under his arm, and a terrible new understanding settling into his chest, that his fine 4 cords of firewood, stacked so proudly and so neatly out there by the trees, might just as well have been stacked on the cold far side of the moon. He got inside. He barred the door behind him, and he sat down on the floor, with his back pressed hard against it, and he did not get up again for a long, long while. But she knew none of this. Up on her high, cold ridge, sealed in tight against the roaring dark, Cora Hale knew only the low, steady note of the wind against her west wall, and the small, clean fire in her grate, and the good dry wood, waiting patient for her in the deep and silent heart of the mountain. She lived by candle now, and by that fire. The drifts against the west wall had climbed up past the height of a tall man, and were climbing still. She could no longer see out of any window in the whole house. The entire world had narrowed itself down to the one warm, small room, the soft breathing of the mule, the steady ticking of the fire. On the second afternoon of the storm, she took the letter out of the tin box. She had not once opened it since the day she had ridden back up the mountain from the settlement. She had told herself, in all the long weeks since, that she was only preserving it, that it was the last real piece of him she had, and that a person surely had a right and a reason to preserve such a thing. She saw now by the low and honest candlelight that this had not been the whole of the truth. She had not opened it, because to open it would ask her to admit a thing she had not, until this very hour, been ready in her heart to admit. She opened it, The paper had gone soft as cloth along the folds. His hand was the same forward slanting hand she had once watched him practice at a kitchen table in a green country in the first winter she had ever known him. He had written about the claim, about the partner, about the mud, and the coffee at the cook tent, and the way the summer light in that far silver country was, in his own words, the color of the inside of a peach. She read the letter twice through, all the way to the end. Then she folded it back up, carefully, along its soft, worn seams, and she put it back into the tin box, and she closed the lid, and she sat for a long, long time, looking into the fire. He was not coming back. Not this winter, not in the spring, not ever again. She had known it. In some deep and buried part of herself, she had known it since the gray morning at the settlement, when a lean man behind a counter had not been able to lift his eyes to meet her own. She had refused, all this time, to let herself fully know it, because to know it truly, all the way down, was to admit a hard thing, that the woman who had been waiting, all these long and aching months, inside the warm, safe cabin, for the man out in the wide, cold world to come home to her at last, had been, for some time now, waiting for no one at all. She let herself know it now. She said the thing aloud, so that the small warm room would hear her say it, and hold it for her. I am not a wife anymore. The fire ticked in the grate. The wind held its low, endless note against the wall. I am the woman who is going to live through this winter. She drew in a slow, steady breath. That is who I am now, and that is enough. She stood up. She banked the fire down, and she took out the small leather book, and she wrote 3 lines in it, in her plain girlhood hand, and this time she did not underline any one of them, because they did not need it. The tunnel holds, the wood is dry. She is alone in this cabin, and she is not lost. She closed the book, and something, low beneath her breastbone, something that had been braced hard for weeks and weeks and weeks against the terrible standing possibility of being wrong, came loose all at once, for the very first time. She did not mistake it for happiness. It was not happiness. It was the particular, bone-deep quiet that comes into a person only when a long and bitter and exhausting argument with one's own self has finally, at long last, come to its end. The storm did not know any of this. The storm knew nothing of letters, nothing of grief, nothing of a woman coming quietly and alone to terms with the whole shape of her one life. In the dark, beating heart of a mountain, it only went on, hour after hour, day after day, and night after night. That low, unbroken note against the west wall, the white roaring past the buried windows, the cold reaching down, again and again, out of a leaden sky, to test every single thing that she had made with her own 2 ruined hands. And in the warm, small room, sealed in against the whole of it, a woman fed her fire on a careful schedule, from a supply of good, dry, clean-burning wood, the very wood that the whole valley below had sworn to her would rot and mold and betray her in the end. She fed it to the flames, one clean log at a time, and she waited, steady and unafraid now, for the mountain to make up its mind. The storm ran for 5 days. 5 days and 5 nights of that low, unbroken note against the west wall. And through all of it, in the warm, small room, a woman kept her fire alive, one clean log at a time, drawn from the dark heart of the mountain behind her. But the mountain was not finished testing her. On the third day, at the very height of the storm, she heard a sound she had not been listening for. It came from the tunnel, not the wind. She knew the wind now, the way you know a voice through a wall. This was something else. A low, soft thump, muffled by the earth between. And then, after it, a smaller patter, like a handful of dry beans dropped onto a plank floor. She went still. She set down her cup. She rose from the chair by the fire, and she opened the north hatch. The lantern she kept just inside the tunnel mouth had gone out. She lit it again from the hearth, her hands steady, and she stepped through into the cool dark, the light held up high before her. She walked past the first stack of wood, past the second, and at the third stack, some 8 feet in, she stopped, and she lifted the lantern to the ceiling. Above the wood, a section of the earth roof had come loose. A piece of it, the size and rough shape of a large serving platter, had fallen away and dropped down onto the top of the stack. Small stones and packed clay lay scattered along the floor. The hole was not deep. 3 inches, perhaps, at its very worst. She stood there a long moment, the lantern held high, and she read the thing the mountain was telling her. The hole was not going to bring the tunnel down. Not today, not this week. She could see, even in the low light, that the collapse had simply followed a small fault in the old glacial earth. A place where a single stone, the size of her fist, had sat cradled in softer clay. And the long shudder of the wind, the slow settling of everything, had finally worked it free. It was a small thing, but it was telling her a very large thing. The tunnel was not permanent. The tunnel was a thing she had made, and everything a person makes goes on requiring them, goes on asking for their care. And if she did not give it that care, the mountain would quietly, patiently take the whole of it back, at its own pace, on its own terms. She thought then, standing in the cold dark, of her grandmother's stone room. She had always remembered it as a thing that simply worked, a place that had always been cool, always been dry, always kept its quiet promise, year after year, without fail. She saw now that this had been a child's way of seeing it. The stone room had worked, because an old man had spent 60 years working on it, resetting the stones, shoring the entry, clearing the drainage, in ways so small and so steady and so constant that to a watching child they had looked like nothing at all. She understood now that they had not been nothing. They had been everything. She was going to have to shore the ceiling. Now, today, in the middle of the storm, with her hands already tired and her back already aching, in a space where she could not even stand fully upright. So that is what she did. She went back into the cabin, and she took down the small bookshelf from beside the bedroom door, the one he had built, in their first summer together, from lengths of fir. She unscrewed the shelves and then the 2 upright sides, 4 straight boards, when she had it all apart, each of them the length of an outstretched arm. She carried them into the tunnel, 2 at a time, and there, sitting back on her heels in a space too low to stand in, she began to build. She sank the first 2 boards into the packed floor at the base of each wall, and she wedged them tight up against the ceiling with small wooden shims she cut, one by one, from the ends she had trimmed. She drove a cross brace between them at the top, with 2 nails from a tin she had kept on the mantel for just such a moment. Then she did it all again, a foot further in. She worked with the lantern hung from the iron hook. She worked while the dirt kept trickling down, soft and steady, onto her hair, onto her shoulders, from the small dark hole above. It took her 4 hours. 4 hours of overhead work, sitting on her heels, on the 3rd day of a 5-day storm, with nothing but a guttering lantern and the low, endless voice of the wind for company. When she was finally done, her thumbs were raw where the hammer had caught them twice, and her lower back had passed from pain into a kind of deep, numb throb she remembered from the hardest work of the summer before. She sat down, right there on the packed floor of the tunnel, her back against the west wall of firewood, and she looked up at the crude little cross of pine she had set between herself and several tons of glacial earth. It was rough work. It was not the work a fine carpenter would have done. It would hold. She knew it would hold. She sat there a while longer, in the cool dark, breathing. And then she got up, and she stepped back into the cabin, and she sealed the hatch behind her. She washed her hands in a basin of water warmed on the fire, and she sat down at the table with a piece of hard biscuit and a cup of coffee. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the plain, honest exhaustion of 4 straight hours of work above her own head. She let them shake. She ate the biscuit, she drank the coffee, and she thought about the fact that no one else in all that valley knew or would ever know that she had done this thing, that she had crawled into a hole in a mountain, in the teeth of the worst storm any of them had seen, and shored up a ceiling with the boards of her dead marriage's bookshelf, alone, in the dark. And she thought about the fact that this did not matter. The mountain knew. She knew. That was the whole of the quorum that was ever required. The 4th day of the storm brought no change in the wind, and a fresh, deep drop in the cold. She burned 12 pieces of firewood that day. She sat in her chair by the fire, and she read from an old brown book the widow down in the settlement had lent her, long ago, in a kinder season. 6 chapters, about a woman in a far country who had also come into a hard and difficult inheritance of land. She fed the mule an extra measure of oats, and she stood a while in his warm stall, her forehead resting against his neck, taking a plain animal comfort from the great slow beating of his heart. And somewhere in the middle of that 4th afternoon, she noticed the cat. A small tabby thing, curled up tight in the far corner of the hearth. 4 white feet tucked under an otherwise ordinary coat. She did not remember letting a cat in. She could not, in fact, remember ever once seeing this cat before that very afternoon. But she understood, after a moment, how it had come. It must have slipped into the tunnel some time before the storm, unnoticed, seeking shelter from the cold. And it must have found the open hatch while she was shoring the ceiling the day before. And it must have decided, in the way of cats, that a warm hearth was a far finer thing than a cold stack of firewood. She named him Boots, for the 4 white feet. She fed him a thin strip of the smoked meat, and he ate it without ceremony, and then he came back and pressed his small, hard head against her ankle, and asked, in the way of cats, for nothing at all except that she be there. She sat down on the floor with him for a while, because she found that she needed to. She had not, she realized, touched another living, breathing thing that wanted her near it in a very long time. Down in the valley, on that same fourth day, the little girl's fever came up. Her father had gone out one last time at first light, with a length of cord tied around his waist, and the other end knotted fast to the door hinge, so that the white could not swallow him whole. He came back with 4 more logs, and a face gone so pale that his wife did not let him take off his own coat. She did it for him. She wrapped him in a quilt. She put him in the rocker by the fire. Then she turned to the children. The eldest boy sat on the floor, holding his little sister's hand, and the youngest, the small girl, lay in the little wooden bed by the wall. Her face was red. Her breathing had a small, wet catch in it at the end of each breath. The mother bent and laid her palm on the child's forehead. It was hotter than the stove. She straightened slowly. She looked at her husband in the rocker, and she did not have to say the thing she was thinking. He nodded once from the chair. "Read to her," he said, his voice low and rough. "Read her something. Whatever she likes. Read it soft." And the boy, who was only 8 years old and who had been trying since the very first day of the storm to be a man his father could be proud of, opened the small family book on his lap. He found the old familiar passage, the one about green pastures and still waters, and he read it aloud, in a voice that shook only twice, and both times he mastered it, and he went on. The little girl did not open her eyes. Her breathing kept its small, wet catch. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed and held her hot, small hand. Her father sat in the rocker, wrapped in the quilt, and outside the wind kept its low, steady, endless note against the west wall. That family would live, all of them. The little girl's fever would break in time, some days after the wind at last died. She would carry a small, soft scar in her lungs the rest of her long life, a faint rasp at the very bottom of each breath that would still be with her when she was a very old woman, in a house of her own, telling her own grandchildren about the great storm of her childhood. And the one thing she would remember of it, she would say, was the sound of her older brother's voice, reading her the words about the green pastures in the dark, while the wind tried to come in. She would say she thought, at the time, that it was something holy, speaking to her through her brother's shaking voice. She would say she still thought so. The 5th day of the storm was the day the wind finally broke. It happened without any warning at all, somewhere in the middle of the afternoon. The low, steady note against the west wall, the note that had gone on, unbroken, for 5 whole days and nights, simply thinned. Then it slackened. Then it was gone. And in the place where it had been, there came a silence so strange, so total, so unfamiliar after all that endless roaring, that she put down her book, and she stood up, and she walked to the window, and she pressed her ear flat against the cold glass. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of the drifted snow settling against itself as the wind released its long pressure. She could hear the small tick of the fire. She could hear the cat breathing, asleep on the hearth. And she could hear, and this was almost more than she could bear after 5 days of that wind, the sound of her own heartbeat in her own ears. She did not open the door. She had learned enough in her long weeks on that mountain to know that the cold, after a storm like this one, would fall even deeper than the cold during it. So she did not open the door. Instead, she banked the fire, and she set on a fresh pot of water, and she took, from the small trunk under the bed, a bar of hard yellow soap she had been saving for a day she had privately, in her own heart, come to call the first day of the world after. She poured the hot water into the basin, and she washed. She washed her face for the first time in 5 days. She washed her hands past the wrists and her neck. She washed her hair with a small tin cup, working the soap down through the roots and rinsing it out slow over the basin so that not a drop of the warm water was wasted. She combed her hair out by the fire. She put on a fresh shift from the very bottom of the trunk, one that had not been out of its folded square of cloth in half a year, and she sat down by the hearth in a clean gown, and she drank a small cup of coffee, sweetened with the very last of the maple sugar the old widow had sent up to her in a kinder season, and she watched the cat wash his own face with one small white paw. She did not weep. She had, in some private accounting of her own, used up all her weeping already. On the afternoon, she had read the letter and let herself, at last, know the truth of it. What she felt now, instead, sitting on the warm hearth in a clean gown with a warm cup in her 2 hands, was the strange, still, quiet relief of a person who has survived a thing she was told, for many long weeks, by nearly everyone she knew, that she would not survive. She got into bed early that night, and she slept 9 full hours without stirring once, and she dreamed of her grandmother in the green country, in a summer garden, bending down to pull the weeds from a long row, in a light the color of warm butter. Her grandmother did not look up. She did not lift her head from the row, but she spoke. "You always did know how to listen to a wall, child," the old woman said into the warm summer earth. "You always did." And she woke with the words still in her ears, and no way at all to tell whether they had come to her from a dream, or from some deep and patient corner of her own self that had only been waiting all this time for the storm to end, so that it might finally speak. She spent the next day inside, still. She was not fool enough to open the door yet. She fed the fire on her schedule. She mended a tear in her outer coat with heavy waxed thread. She read 3 more chapters of the old brown book, and she played, for a while, with a length of twine tied to a bit of cork, teasing the cat into leaping at it from the hearthrug. And when the cat missed the cork by a full foot, and landed on his side on the floorboards with a look of the gravest and most wounded feline betrayal, she laughed out loud. The sound of it startled her. It seemed to come from very far away, and from very long ago. She had not laughed, not once, in all the long weeks since the day she had ridden down the mountain to ask a question she already, in her heart, knew the answer to. The laugh surprised her so much that she went quiet after it, and sat there a while, just looking at the fire and at the cat, who had already forgiven her and forgotten the whole affair. And she thought that perhaps this, too, was a kind of thing the earth held for a person, that if you dig yourself a shelter, and you tend it, and you wait out the worst of the dark inside it, then somewhere on the far side of the storm, without your ever quite planning it, there might be a clean gown, and a warm cup, and the sound of your own laughter, coming back to you like an old friend from a great distance. When at last she opened the door, on the morning after that, the world outside was not the world she had left. That old world had been a working homestead in a heavy winter. This one was a sea of white, so still and so bright under the low sun that it hurt her eyes to look at it. Drifts rose to the very eaves of the west wall, frozen in a great cresting wave that had never broken. The pines below the clearing were buried to their lower branches. The path she had shoveled to the tunnel was simply gone, under 6 feet of new snow. And the switchback trail down to the valley did not exist. It had been erased, as though it had never been. There was nothing out there at all, in any direction, but sky and snow, and the small dark line of her own chimney smoke rising straight up into an air gone so perfectly still it might have been painted. She stood in the doorway a long time. She was alive. She was warm. And she still had, by her own rough count made that morning by lantern light in the tunnel, more than half of her firewood. She did not yet know that this last fact was the whole miracle. She did not yet know what the storm had done down in the valley below her. To the family near the confluence, to the man with his 4 fine cords stacked out by the trees, to all the others in all the other cabins who had done the sensible thing, the reasonable thing, the thing that everyone knew was right. She would learn all of that soon enough. They would come up the mountain, one at a time, and tell her, but not yet. For now, there was only this: a woman standing in her own doorway, in a clean world of impossible white, alive, warm, with more than half her wood still dry in the heart of the mountain behind her. 2 days later, she strapped on the snowshoes he had made for her in a kinder season. She filled a canvas pack with 4 split logs and a small tin of coffee and a hard end of the smoked meat. And she started down the mountain to find out who was still alive. The trip took her 3.5 hours, where once it had taken 40 minutes. She broke trail through drifts that came to her waist. She went around downed pines she could not climb over. She dropped once to her armpits into a snow-covered creek bed and hauled herself out again on the strap of her own snowshoe, breathing hard, and went on. She came at last into the little hollow above the family's clearing, and the first thing she saw was the smoke. It was gray, and it was heavy, and it hung there in the still air above the roof, low and struggling. And she knew, even from 100 yards off, even before she knew anything else, that the fire in that cabin was dying. She knocked at the door. The mother opened it, and her face was drawn tight around the eyes in a way that told the whole story of the last 5 days without a single word. Behind her, the father sat in the rocker, wrapped in the quilt. The little girl lay in the bed by the wall, her small face still flushed, a damp rag on her forehead. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, his hair uncombed for days, and the whole room smelled of wood smoke that had not properly drawn, and of something underneath the smoke that Cora knew without wanting to name it. The smell of a household that had come very, very close to losing everything. The mother looked at the pack on Cora's shoulders. She looked at the shape of the split logs against the canvas. She looked back up at Cora's face, and the tightness around her eyes broke all at once into something else, and she began to cry, without making any sound at all. Cora stepped inside. She set the pack down. She unpacked the 4 dry logs and set them by the hearth. She unpacked the coffee and the meat and set them on the small table. She looked at the fire where a wet, hopeless round of pine sat steaming on the coals, giving nothing back. She took it off with the poker, and she laid one of her own splits down on the coals in its place. It caught inside of a minute. Clean flame, almost no smoke. The whole room seemed to lean toward the light of it. The mother was still crying, without sound, and Cora crossed to her and put an arm around her thin shoulders, and she did not say anything for a while, and then, when she did speak, it was quietly, in a voice she meant for the mother alone, though the whole small room could hear. "I have wood enough for the both of us," she said. "I will come again, the day after tomorrow, and the day after that. I will keep coming until yours is dry." The fire took and grew, and threw its clean warmth out into the room. "You are not going to lose that child," Cora said. "Not to the storm, not to the cold." She held the weeping woman a little tighter. "Not on my mountain." And the mother could not answer her. She did not have to. She kept her word. She came again, the day after, with 3 more logs and a small tin of broth she had made from a saved bone and the last of her dried herbs. And the day after that. And the one after that. And on one of those cold, bright mornings, at last, the little girl's fever broke. And the mountain, having decided at last to let her live, began to send the others to her door. The first was the man with the wagon. She heard the hooves before she saw him. Not the wagon this time. A single shaggy mare, coming slow and steady up the switchback, over ground where the trail had begun, just barely, to show itself again through the melting snow. She stepped out into the clearing, one hand shading her eyes. The rider grew larger, and then large enough to know. It was Amos Carter. The last time he had been in that clearing, he had touched 2 fingers to his hat, and told her she would need every bit of her luck. She did not go out to meet him. She waited by the door. She let him come to her. He drew rein a short way off, and he sat there a moment, on the mare, without a word. He looked at the chimney, at the thin, clean, pale line of smoke rising straight up into the still air, so clean it might have been drawn with a fine pen. He looked at the mouth of the tunnel, its wooden door half cleared, visible now through the drift. He looked at her. Then he climbed down, slow, stiff. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Mr. Carter." She did not say more than that. She only looked at him, because she understood now why he had come. He had come up this mountain not knowing which of 2 things he would find. He had come, in his heart, half expecting a body, and he had ridden into her clearing and seen the smoke and understood, before he understood anything else at all, that he had been wrong about her for every single one of those long weeks. She let the silence go on a little longer than kindness strictly required, and then she let him off it. "Where else would I be, Mr. Carter?" He took his hat off. He held it against his chest, and when he finally spoke, there was a thing in his voice she had never once heard from him before. The small, careful shape of a man's shame, worn openly in front of the very woman it belonged to. "I have been coming up this valley a long time, ma'am," he said. "In all that time, I have watched a great many folks make their mistakes with the winter. I have watched some of them die of it." He turned his hat in his hands. "I would like to tell you I came up here just to see whether you were still living. And that would be a true thing to say, but it would not be the whole of the truth." He looked at her Steady now. The whole truth is, I came up here to find out how you did it. Every other chimney in this valley is telling a hard story right now. Yours is telling a different one. And I rode past 6 of them yesterday, ma'am, to be sure of it. He turned the hat again. I would be obliged if you would let me come in and warm my hands at your fire. And I would like, before I go back down that mountain, to know what a woman knew that I did not. She looked at him a long moment. Then she stepped aside from the door. Come in, Mr. Carter, she said. There is coffee. He tied the mare to the porch post, and he crossed the threshold of her cabin for the first time in his life, and he stopped just inside, and he looked, without meaning to, at the small wooden hatch cut into the north wall. He looked at it a long time. He did not speak, and somewhere inside him, she could see it happen. A thing he had believed for many, many years about the shape of good sense in the world, and about who was allowed to have it, quietly rearranging itself. She let him have the time. She poured the coffee. He sat at her table the better part of an hour, and he asked her his questions, one at a time, in the plain order a man asks them who is trying to build a picture in his own head that he can carry back down a mountain to other men. How deep, how wide, what angle to shed the water, whether the stone floor mattered, how she had cut the hatch through the log wall without weakening the corner of the house. He wrote each answer down. In the back of a small ledger he carried in his saddlebag for the tallying of flour and salt. He wrote in a neat hand, because a careful man keeps a careful hand. And when she had answered the last of them, he closed the ledger, and he stood, and he put his hat back on. He looked at her across the table. You saved a household this week, Mrs. Hale, not your own. You went down that ridge with wood off your own stack 3 times, they tell me, and the second time you brought broth. He paused. They do not have the language to tell you what they owe you. I am not going to try to add anything to that. He settled the hat. I will only tell you this. There are folks down in the settlement already who want to know if you would let them come up and see it and learn it. She looked at the fire. She looked at the cat, asleep on the hearth rug. She looked back at Amos Carter. Tell them the door is open, she said, and tell them to bring their own coffee. A small, tired smile touched the corner of her mouth. Mine is running low. That was the line that traveled down the mountain ahead of him. It got told and retold in the trading post all through the thaw, with the small, careful pride of men who like to repeat a good line. And it broke all at once, the last of the sad story the valley had been telling about her since the start of the cold. The pity did not survive it. Nothing survives being made to laugh at itself. The widow who was going to die in her burrow had turned into a woman who was inviting the whole valley up to her table and asking them in the same breath to bring their own coffee. The story changed, slowly at first, and then all the way. The Wintermen came up next, the 2 brothers. They came on foot, both of their horses lost to the storm. They broke a trail that had already been broken twice that week by other feet. And the elder one, Reuben, wore a scarf pulled up high over his mouth. He kept it there, even in the yard. She met them at the door. She let them in without ceremony. She poured the coffee. She set out the last of the smoked meat, sliced thin, on a small blue plate. She let the elder brother sit with his back to the fire, and she did not ask him to lower the scarf. She waited for him to lower it himself. He did after the second cup, and underneath it, his face was thinner than it had been, and there was a small permanent hollow beside his mouth that had not been there before the storm. She understood, without being told, what the smoke had cost him in that dugout up above the trees, what it had taken out of his chest. That would not be coming back. He set both his hands flat on the table. "Ma'am," he said, "I have owed you a plain sentence since the middle of the storm. I have carried it all the way up this mountain today, so I could hand it to you in your own kitchen." He looked at her. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about the tunnel. And I was wrong about what a woman who had never wintered up this high could know, that I did not." The fire ticked. "I have been a mountain man in this country my whole life, and in a handful of weeks, alone, you built a thing that I never once in all those years thought to build." He was quiet a moment. "I do not know what to do with that, except to say it out loud to you, and hope the saying of it settles some part of the account." She did not answer at once. She looked at his hands, flat on the wood. She looked at the small hollow beside his mouth. She thought about what he had spent, so that he could arrive at the sentence he had just spoken. "The account is settled, Mr. Calder," she said. "It was settled the day you stood in my clearing and marked the spot where you thought my grave would be, and promised you would come back and honor it." She held his eyes. Most men would not have made that promise to a woman they believed was already gone. "You did. That mattered to me. It matters still." He did not answer. He only nodded once, and he drank his coffee. The younger brother, at the door, on the way out, tried to find words for a thing he had said aloud. In the dugout, at the very height of the smoke, he could not find them. In the end, he only raised a hand to her, palm open, and held it there a moment before he turned and stepped down off the porch. And she understood him. She had learned, in the long weeks of that winter, to understand a great many things that men could not put into words. After that, her clearing became a quiet kind of destination, not a pilgrimage, something more useful than that. Men came up in 2s and 3s on the days the trail would allow it. They stood at the mouth of the tunnel. They asked to be let inside. She let them in, one at a time, with a lantern, because 2 grown men in that tunnel at once could not have turned around. They looked at the arch of the ceiling. They looked at the stone floor. They looked at the crude little cross of pine she had used to shore the small cave in the teeth of the storm. They asked her their questions. She answered them, and she never once, in any of it, set herself up as a teacher. She only presented herself as a woman who had done a thing that worked, and who was willing to describe the thing in the plain terms that had made it work. And the men, most of them older than she was, listened. They listened in a way she had not, in all her life, been listened to by men before. It was not the listening of praise. It was the listening of practical people who had finally understood that they were being handed for free a piece of knowledge that would keep their own families alive. The next time, the sky went the color of old lead. The old widow came up in the last of the thaw. She came in a small sledge drawn by a rented pony, driven by a neighbor's boy. She had not made a trip that steep in years. She climbed down slow, both hands on the boy's shoulder, and she stood in the yard and looked at the cabin, and at the tunnel mouth, and at the woman who came out to meet her. And she did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She put her arms around Cora, and she held on. "I thought you were dead, honey," she said into Cora's shoulder. "I thought I had sent flaxseed to a woman who was already gone. I told myself you were the last of my people I would ever have to lose." Her old arms tightened. "I have not slept a whole night through since the news came down." And Cora let herself, for one moment, be held. She had not been held by another living soul since the morning a red-haired man had walked down the switchback and vanished into the pines. She had not known, until those small, strong arms went around her, how much of her own body had been holding itself together, all this time, against the absence of exactly that. "I am here," she said. "I am here. Come in and sit down." The old woman sat at her table the better part of the afternoon. She would not go into the tunnel. The low crouch was more than her back would give. But she sat by the fire with the cat on her lap, and she looked at the small wooden hatch in the north wall, as though it were the most ordinary miracle she had ever laid eyes on. And she had brought something with her, a bundle of letters. 9 of them. All from women. Women in the valley Cora had never met. Women who had heard the story, the new one, the true one, that was quietly replacing the old. Women who had questions about how a person might prepare her own place for the next hard winter, and who did not know a single other woman they could ask. The old widow set the letters on the table, and she laid her small, worn hand flat on top of them. "They are asking you, honey," she said. "Not the wagon man, not the Winter brothers. You." She patted the letters once. "There is a thing a woman can hear from another woman that she cannot hear from any man, no matter how kindly he means it. These women are not asking to be impressed. They are asking to be shown." She looked up. "If you have the strength for it, I would like to sit right here beside you while you write them back." And so she did. Cora read the letters that afternoon by the light of the south window, and over the next several days she wrote 9 replies in her own plain, unhurried hand. Each one a page, or a page and a half. Each one built around the particular trouble of the woman who had written it, and she signed each one, not with any grand or borrowed title. She signed each one simply with her own name. The old widow carried the sealed letters back down the mountain with her when she went, and within a season those letters had been read aloud, in kitchens, in valleys Cora had never seen. And the winter after, 3 of the women who had received one had begun their own tunnels, behind their own cabins, with their husbands helping, if the husbands were willing, and without them, if they were not. And this was the thing that surprised her most of all. Not the surviving. She had planned the surviving. She had drawn it out on butcher paper by candlelight and dug it out of a mountain with her own 2 hands. But this, the letters, the women, the far-off kitchens, this she had never once planned. A thing she had made, only to save her own life, had somehow gotten loose in the world, and it did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to whoever was willing to pick up the pickaxe. Now, the last of the story. He came up the switchback on a hired horse in the soft light of a late spring afternoon, on a day when the mud in the yard had gone warm. He was thinner than she remembered. His red hair had gone the color of old brick along the temples, and he had a beard, trimmed recently, but not well. He rode into her clearing, and he sat on the horse a long moment before he swung down, because he did not know, in that moment, whether he had the right to. Elias. She was in the garden when she saw him, on her knees in the warm earth, setting cabbage starts into the terrace bed she had built, herself. In the seasons, he was gone. She had a trowel in her hand, dirt on her knuckles, a straw hat pushed back off her forehead. She saw him swing down. She saw him stand there, beside the horse, the reins loose in his fingers. And she recognized him in the very same instant and in the very same way that she had once recognized the color of the sky over the ridge on the morning the storm came. A thing that arrived in her body before her mind had any time at all to make words out of it. She did not stand up. She stayed there, on her knees, in the dirt, and she looked at him across the whole width of the yard. Cora, he said. He had always called her that. Just that. No one else ever had. Hearing it now, in her own yard, in the light of a spring she had built with her own hands, it did a thing to her chest that she was not going to let show on her face. She stood, slowly. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not walk toward him. She waited, and he walked toward her, and he stopped, 4 paces off, and he did not, she noted, try to take her in his arms. He had learned something, somewhere, in all that time away, or someone down in the valley had told him, or he had understood on his own, on the long ride up, that the woman he had left was not the woman he was standing in front of now. I did not know if you would still be here, he said. I did not know if you would still be alive. I heard the story down below from a man named Carter. He did not know who I was. He told me about the tunnel and the winter and the letters. His voice was low. He told me about you the way a man tells a stranger about someone he has come to respect, and I sat there, and I let him, because I did not have the right to say the word husband in front of him, before I had said it in front of you. She listened. She let him finish it. The claim came to nothing, he said. The partner sold me out. I lost the vein. I lost the grubstake. And I told myself I could not come back to you with nothing in my hands. I know now that was not a good enough reason. I got the lung fever the winter after. I near died of it, in a boarding house, a long way from here. And it took me all this time to earn back enough to come home and to find the nerve. He looked at the ground. Then he looked back up at her. I am not here to ask you to take me back the way it was. I do not have any right to that. I am here because I could not go on being a man in the world without standing in front of you and saying that I did not do right by you, and that I know it, and that I am asking, on whatever terms you will give me, for a chance to do better. She was quiet a long time. She looked at him, and she thought about the letter, and the tin box, and the sentence she had said aloud to the empty room in the middle of the storm. She was not a wife anymore. She was the woman who had lived through that winter. She thought about the woman she had been, in the fall, waiting, and the woman she was now, standing in her own boots, in her own garden, on her own mountain. And when at last she spoke, her voice was steady, and it was kind, and it did not waver at all. You do not sleep in the cabin, Elias. Not tonight. Not this season. The cabin is mine. I built the whole second half of who I am inside it after you left. She let that stand. There is a lean-to behind the shed. It is dry. If you want to stay, you stay there. And you work. You work the way any hand works that I have hired to work for me. If you take a wage from my hand, it is because you have earned the wage. She did not look away from him. We do not resume anything today. We do not resume anything next month. We will speak, when the leaves turn, about whatever has grown between us by then, and we will decide it then, together. She lifted her chin. If you cannot live with those terms, then you should get back on that horse right now, because I do not have any other terms to offer you. He looked down at the warm ground. He looked back up at her, and his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it from her. I accept, he said. He worked for her that season, and into the next. He cut wood. He extended the tunnel 6 feet on the north side. He helped her build a small second chamber off the main passage for the storing of roots through the cold. And he did not, in any of that time, ask her for one single thing other than the work. And then, on a quiet evening, when the light was going gold behind the ridge, and the two of them sat on the porch after a long day, she told him, without looking at him, that he could move his bedroll into the small back room of the cabin the following week. If he wished it, he wished it, he moved it. They did not become, that autumn, married again. Not in any way that a settlement congregation would have recognized. They became, instead, two people who lived in the same house and worked the same claim and spoke in the evenings of things of common interest. It was not what she had once imagined a marriage was. It was, she came to understand, over that long, quiet winter, a good deal better than what she had once imagined it to be, because she had built this one herself, on her own terms, out of an honesty she had not even known was available to her, back when she was a girl of 24, standing at an altar in a dress her mother had sewn. They stood together at the mouth of the tunnel on a still morning near the end of that winter. The mouth had a proper wooden door on it now, on iron hinges, forged for her by one of the men she had taught, in payment for wood she had once sold him. And below them, all across the valley, chimneys sent up their small, clean, pale columns of smoke into the morning air, more than she could easily count. And every one of them belonged to a household that had built, behind its own north wall, some version of the thing she had first dreamed up, in the dark, in the cold, by candlelight, alone. He put his hand on her shoulder. It was a light touch. It asked for nothing. You did not invent it, he said gently. You keep saying that. She looked out over the valley. She thought about her grandmother's hand on a packed clay wall in a green country, in a summer a whole lifetime ago. She thought about a girl of 6, standing in cool dark air, with her small arm raised to a temperature that had refused for 100 winters to fall. She thought about the long line of hands going back and back before that grandmother and before that stone room, that had all somehow known how to ask an ordinary hill for one small, ordinary mercy. No, she said, I did not invent it. Her breath made a small cloud in the cold morning air and drifted off and was gone. I remembered it. And there is a difference between those two things. She was quiet a moment. That is all any of us is ever doing, I think, when we are doing our best work. We are remembering the right thing at the right time when we most need it. She put her palm flat against the wooden door of the tunnel, on the smooth grain where the iron hinges had been set flush. And when you can do that, when you can remember the right thing at the very moment it might save your life, that is not a smaller thing than invention. She held her hand there. It may be the whole of what invention ever was. He did not answer her. She had not expected him to. She took her hand from the door, and she turned and she walked back down through the yard, past the garden where the first green was coming up in strong, straight rows, past the mule browsing at the fence, past the porch where the cat lay asleep in a warm square of afternoon sun. She went inside the cabin she had held together with her own two hands through the hardest winter of her life. She put the kettle on, and she sat down at her own table, in her own kitchen, in the life she had chosen, and had not at any point, and to no one at all, surrendered. Outside, the last of the winter snow was going soft on the mountain, and somewhere below her, in a valley that had once gathered quietly to grieve her, a great many small, clean fires were burning, warm and bright, and hers in a way, every single one of them.